Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Caparrelli, and I am the only one who spent 100 hours with a New York serial killer.
Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and this is The Only One in the Room. But I'm never the only one in this room because, as usual, my boyfriend, producer, and co host, Scott Slaughter, who I call Hun, is here as well.
Hi, honey.
Hey, Hun.
I'm actually upstairs.
I know, but I just like to say you're in the
I
room.
know.
You're in the
I know.
proverbial room.
I like to just throw it out there because people are like, huh? They don't look like they're in the same room.
Well, we kind of like our anyway.
Yeah. I know.
Our backgrounds are really similar. So I don't know if you're ready for this conversation, Hannah. Did you get ready for this conversation?
I don't think I am, but I'm actually excited. This is a little bit of a thing for me. I mean,
Yeah.
I read a little bit about these. These are books that interest me, so I'm really excited that
We're talking about serial killers, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So listen to this. So one of the most notorious chapters in American criminal history, and people who are my age absolutely know this, regardless of wherever they were in the country at that point. There's the son of Sam, and that was David Berkowitz, infamous serial killer. He terrorized New York City in the 1970s. And his capture in August 1977 marked the end of his reign of terror, leading to his imprisonment and conviction for multiple murders. The Son of Sam case still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But a lot of people have never heard of him, and we were just talking about that before. And this is another good reason to have this conversation with Dr. Caparrelli today, who I'm going to introduce in a second. So just a little bit more about the Son of Sam. He was known as the 44 caliber killer. It's an American serial killer who pled guilty to 8 shootings that began in New York City on July 29th, 1976. He grew up in New York City, David Berkowitz, and served in the U.S. Army. He used a 44 special caliber bulldog revolver. I'm not sure why that's important, but I'm sure with my conversation with Dr. Caparelli, we'll find out. He killed 6 people and he wounded 7 others by July 1977, terrorized New Yorkers. He eluded police. It was the biggest manhunt in the city's history. And he was leaving letters that mocked the police and promised further crimes, which were highly publicized by the press. So today, our guest is Dr. Michael Caparrelli. He's the author of the 2023 book, Monster Mirror, written after spending 100 hours in prison interviews with David Berkowitz. So, Dr. Caparrelli, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Laura. It's a privilege to be here.
I'm really glad that we got to do this interview. Like Scott says, Scott's really interested in serial killers. I'm really interested in history and people's stories and biographies. I think your story is really interesting, but it's even more interesting, compounded with the fact that you spent so much time with the Son of Sam. So can you just tell me a little bit, like you were a pastor for 16 years, is that correct?
Yes, I pastored a church in Providence Providence, Rhode Island, about an hour from Boston, 2 hours from New York City. Pastored there for about 16 years. It was a church that was very active in helping people that were reacclimating to society, that were leaving the prison and coming back into free world. Worked with the mentally ill, those with addictions, a very urban kind of church, and did that for about 16 years until I actually suffered 2 heart attacks. I had a minor heart attack in my early 40s, and then I had a couple of years later the widowmaker that kills 83% of the people. Just really burnt out from counseling, pastoring, people from all sorts of broken backgrounds. And then I just finished my PhD in behavioral science back in the 2019. So the timing was perfect. I was able to transition out of pastoring and into a professor at a couple of colleges, an author of several books, and a lecturer on mental health subjects really around the country.
That I didn't know about the heart attacks. First of all, you don't even look like you're in your early 40s yet. So I'm slightly confused about that.
I've got a
But
30-year-old daughter.
wow, wow. Um, yeah, you look great.
Thank you.
I didn't know about the heart attacks, but that's really like a moment where you take a look at your life, right?
Very true.
And see what's important and take that inventory and assess.
Hmm.
Um, I love that you had that background though as a pastor, and then now it's combined with this spiritual, psychological, like, human studies that you've been doing. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, as a pastor, all those years of an urban church, a lot of field experience, face to face with people from all different backgrounds. I actually work with two serial killers in the prison. Both of them I worked with for a few years in the Rhode Island area. Not anybody that anybody would know nationally, although one of them was a teenage serial killer, so he gained some notoriety. Didn't get very far. They played a lot of psychopathic games, more on the side of jailhouse conversion. So as a pastor, I had lots of field experience, but the PhD, in addition to the bachelor's and the master's degree, all my college experience obviously gave me the vocabulary, gave me the vernacular,
Yes.
the theoretical understanding, combined with the practical field experience from years of pastoring.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. And you mentioned jailhouse conversion, which is one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about. Um, but I think that's a really just interesting recipe. All the stuff that you just listed, that you've been through, that you've worked through, that you've learned, that you've had experience in, is a really interesting recipe for the person that you are and like the work that you do today. Um, but jailhouse conversion. So we're talking about the son of Sam, David Berkowitz. I know that in his confession, he claimed that his neighbor's dog, which I think was a black Labrador retriever, I think I have
Correct.
that right, was
Harvey.
possessed. Yeah. What was it?
Harvey.
Harvey. Didn't know that. That Harvey was possessed by an ancient demon and commanded him to kill. So there, a lot of people have said that they were possessed, right? A lot of serial killers. I think that Richard Ramirez did, the Night Stalker. Um, I know that Jeffrey Dahmer became a born again Christian. I don't know if he said that he was possessed by demons, but I wanted to talk to you about that idea that someone came in. I mean, to me, this sounds like mental illness. And I wanted to know if that's what it sounded like to you, or did you actually believe, or do you believe that he was possessed by demons and he is now free of those demons?
Yeah, I don't see the question as an either or answer. I think that that's a typical logical fallacy, is that we think it's either one or the other. I do believe in a demonic reality. Being a clergyman for many years, being a Christian from the time I was 18 years old, I believe in the supernatural realm and demonic influences, but that's not at the expense of mental health. My 34 sessions with David Berkowitz at Shoregun Correctional Facility in New York, we discussed both the mental health factors. I actually list 9 in my book Monster Mirror, which is available on Amazon for sale. But you can read about those 9 themes that are all mental health related, but more specifically, how those mental health factors work in synergy or work in tandem with demonic influences. I mean, I know from what I've seen, not only with David Berkowitz, but from many people, that there is a reality that's beyond the natural and is not observable, but yet we experience it. I think anybody can relate to maybe being in a situation where you lost your temper, you behaved in a way that was unbecoming of your character, not something that you would have planned when you woke up in the morning. And when it was all said and done and you apologize, it's interesting the language that we use. We say things like, I'm sorry, I don't know what possessed me. I'm
Right.
sorry, I don't know what got into me. I apologize, I got carried away. So we use
Mm,
these phrases, and you got to wonder what's behind these phrases. Is it just a phrase? Is it just an axiom? Or is it hinting at, is it insinuating some paranormal energy that whips up, our irritation into rage, Ted Bundy did describe to the FBI that sat with him for 150 hours what he called the entity. He said some foreign power that came over him. Now, that's not to say it's at the expense of free will or human responsibility or psychological factors. I just don't see it that way. I see it working in tandem with some of these psychological realities. So I go at great length in the book to talk about both the mental health as well as the demonic influences and how they work, the interplay between the two.
That's really interesting. And I'm really glad I asked you that question so that you could give me that explanation. I've never, ever thought about those phrases before as meaning anything other than what we use them for today. But you're right. You're right. If I look back, what possessed me, I don't know what got into me, carried away. Those are all things that would link logically to something other than myself taking over at that moment, right?
Yeah, we just had this incident about 4 or 5 years ago. I forget the guy's last name. I know his first name was Chris, but he murdered his wife and his two daughters. Just awful crime. And when he described the murder of his wife and his two daughters, he said it was as if he was sitting in the corner of the room and he was out of the body experience, watching himself on top of his wife, strangling her. So this idea of some type of supernatural energy or out of the body experience, it's pretty common in the data collection amongst serial killers, serial offenders. It's a theme that you'll see resurface over and over. The BTK called it the X factor. He didn't quite know how to describe it. He was reluctant to say the demonic, but he called it the X factor, meaning something outside of himself. And yes, Jeffrey Dahmer did, sitting down with his pastor, who wrote a book about his interviews with Jeffrey Dahmer, he did reference the killings as coming under the influence of something dark.
Wow. Wow. Okay. I want to ask you about the actual process of going from who you are to deciding that you're going to spend some time with David Berkowitz. I know that you mentioned that you had spent time with a couple of other serial killers, but can you first just tell me a little bit about your background? Because I know that you had spent some time when you were a teenager behind bars. I know that your father did. So tell me a little bit about how it was for you growing up and what that looked like.
Yeah, I had the opportunity as a kid to be exposed to the criminal element in a very human kind of way. I mean, my dad was pretty well known in the neighborhood in which I grew up. He was a tough guy. I won't say exactly what he did because that would be violating the Italian American code. But when he was probably in his late 20s, I was about 10 or 11. I remember my mother back in the 80s, early to mid 80s, taking me to the prison to see him. And the euphemism in Italian American families is dad is in college. I said, Ma, where is he? She said, he's in college. So I said, okay. And I believed for at least a few years there until I maybe reached about 11 or 12 that my dad was in school. Then kids in the neighborhood started to tell me, look, your dad is not in school. He's in prison. So, I had this compassion for inmates at a young age because I knew my dad is my dad. I didn't know this other side of him. My dad wasn't in prison too long, but definitely in little spurts throughout my childhood. When I was 17, I ended up getting into some trouble with the law. I was definitely a very depressed teenager. My depression often manifests itself through anger, through rage, through acting aggressively. And me and a couple of friends, we had broke into a car. It was actually a police car, which
Oh,
wasn't too bright. And we end up robbing or burglarizing a home and then surrounded on the highway by the state troopers, taken to the juvenile detention center. And then at 17 years old, while I was in juvenile prison, I heard the gospel from a minister that was also a correctional officer and became a Christian in the prison, left the juvenile jail, and right away went to a Christian college, joined a church family, and from 18 all the way up until now, I'm going into my late 40s. I've walked with Jesus and I've seen transformation in my own personal life, as well as in the ministry of pastoring people.
That's a really that really helps, that background, because it makes so much sense for who you are and what you do now. Can you remember anything that the person who came into that jail while you were there, the juvenile jail, said to you that made you think, "Oh, this is what I want to devote my life to"?
Well, he had a guitar and he sang a song called City Streets. And it was, I don't remember the exact lyrics. I remember that was the title. And the gist of the song was the cries of those in the city streets and how God hears their cries. And he'd given me a Bible. We befriended each other. I actually didn't become a Christian per se in the juvenile prison. I felt God's presence. I responded to it, and my eyes filled with tears. And I went back to my cell and did a little bit of reading. But I made a commitment shortly after I was released, probably about a week after. I'd met somebody else on the outside that was a Christian. That clergyman who came into the prison, he just died 6 months ago.
Mm.
Died of cancer. I want to say he was close to 70 years old or so. But he had me speak over the last 28 or so years, a number of
Wow.
times in the juvenile prison to some of the inmates and share my actual story there.
That's incredible. And really incredible that you kept in contact. So you must have made impressions on each other. You must have made an impression on him, and as obviously he made an impression on you.
Yeah, he actually attended the church here and there. He had his own congregation that he pastored, but when he would get a break or a day off or whatever, he'd come to our service and sit in the back of the service, and we would go for dinner and what have you.
Yeah. So when you were growing up, um, what did you know about the Son of Sam? Did you know the rumors? Do you remember? Were you alive then? You were. No.
Well, I was born right when he was arrested, right in that
Ah,
time period.
okay,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. So what did you know? What did you know before, as you were growing up, before you got interested in him?
Well, my stepfather was from his neighborhood in the Bronx. My stepfather was a very active presence in my childhood, so I heard some stories through him. Of course, being in Providence, just 2 hours away, 2.5 hours away from New York, going to New York City all the time as a kid. Um, Family started there in the early 1900s in Lower Manhattan, coming in through Ellis Island, and so there was a connection to the city. I don't know how popular David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, is nationally, um, at least in my era, growing up in the '80s. But I know that for us being so close, and even having parents that remembered the fear. The fear didn't just stay in New York, but it made its way to New Jersey. It made its way through Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. There was this sense of panic, this almost omnipresence that out of the dark, a man is going to pop up and potentially gun you down. So I definitely had heard the stories. I only knew him as a monster. That's it. I
Yes.
didn't know him as a human being. I didn't know him as a Christian. All I knew him was as a monster, like any other serial killer that you'd watch a movie or read a book about.
Right. And and as someone, like I said, I remember that time period, and I was not in New York, but I remember, I think, and this, I could be making this up, but I think I remember it being a really hot summer when this was all happening, and people were outdoors, but people were scared to be outdoors. I mean, I was a kid, but I remember just that the adults were scared, like something bad was happening. And I was on the East Coast. I was in Cambridge, Mass. Um, and it was a very much like, if it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. Everybody needs to be careful. So tell me then how this happened. How did you end up deciding you're going to go visit him?
Well, back in 2021, I mailed him a copy of a prior book I had written entitled Dr. Jesus. And it was a book dealing with mental health disorders from a biblical perspective. Now, David is a Christian. He has a tremendous amount of respect for the Bible, tremendous amount of respect for clergymen. So I mailed him the book, and within a short time, wasn't longer than a month, it was even shorter. He responded back with a letter saying, "I read your book. I'd love for you to come visit." He said, "I've actually been waiting for someone like you with the
Mm.
qualifications of both a clergyman as well as a PhD in the psychology area, to actually tell my story. So I said, I'd love to come visit you. So I visited him. First session was April 1st, I believe, 2022. The prison was still observing the COVID regulations. We wore masks for those early visits. And during that first visit, we decided that I would begin an analysis of David Berkowitz, and we would put this analysis into a reader friendly format for the average reader to read and understand some of the mental health factors behind his crimes, as well as his transformation behind bars since 1988, and really asking the question: can a psychopath be transformed? Because that is a big question within the culture. Most would say psychopaths are irredeemable. They can't change. There are definitely some genetic variants that have been linked to psychopathy. I discuss a little bit of that in the book. But I do make an argument that while psychopathy is, it shows, the data shows that psychopaths make very little progress in therapy. That this particular psychopath, call it a miracle, call it a marvel, call it what you will, this particular psychopath is demonstrating characteristics, fruit, if you will, over the last 35 years that flies in the face of the criteria, the HERE's checklist on psychopathy.
So it started with you sending him your book,
Mm-hmm.
right? Did you just do this regularly with a lot of people, or was it him in particular that you wanted to read your book?
Well, I had heard his testimony or his conversion story. I gotten wind of that. We had some mutual friends. That also made it a little bit easier. A guy named Don Wilkerson, who pastored a church in Manhattan called Times Square Church for many years.
Hmm.
Don was a mutual friend. Don had visited David.
Yeah.
And, I was curious. I did go into this with a little bit of skepticism. Part of me wanting to visit him was to see, is this real? I had already dealt with two others that had not as extensive of a criminal background as David and nowhere near as notorious, and had reached an impasse in those relationships. Saw how manipulative they were. So I wanted to see if David was in that category, or if this was a bona fide conversion.
Right. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but tell me a little bit about why someone would, why there would be a false conversion, or why someone would pretend to convert. What are the advantages to saying that, oh, now I'm a Christian, when you're already serving, X amount of time in prison? What's the advantage to doing that? Why dupe you, Dr. Caparelli? Like,
Yeah,
why
good
would that?
question. Good question. I mean, well, first of all, jailhouse conversions don't last 35 years. David Berkowitz has been consistent, and I have 1,400 documents pertaining to his psychiatric reports, prison records, police records. I mean, David gave me the full vault. So looking at all the documents over the last 35 years, he's been very consistent in his involvement in the Christian faith. Jailhouse conversions are typically 6 months, if that. And they're not steady, they're spurty. And they
Mm,
usually before a parole hearing. David's not even looking to get out. I mean, he does have parole hearings every 2 years, but he has no expectations. He knows the chances of him making parole are very slim. So it's not about that. He's 71 years old now. He's pretty settled in, 46 years behind bars. But the jailhouse conversions I've seen, they're typically spurty. They're typically prior to a parole committee, trying to make an impression on a parole board. I would surmise that there's also a placating of the conscience. I mean, guilt is an awful, albatross for one
yeah.
to carry. And to placate the conscience, sometimes one talks religious babble, Christianese, just to kind of make one feel as if they're distant or removed from the crimes they've committed.
Yeah. That makes complete sense. And I could see why, having experienced that more than once, you would go into this with a little trepidation, like you said, and curiosity, because this guy is really famous, for a generation. His name, well, not his name, but he also his name, but the moniker he was tagged with, or that he tagged himself with, really just wrought terror around people, and for good reason. I think it's interesting that right in the beginning, and correct me if I'm wrong, the two of you decided that you would document this instead of, because my expectation was that you would have spent 100 hours with him and then decided you were going to tell the story because you've become so invested. But you knew right away, or both of you kind of knew right away.
Yeah, I mean, David is a man of purpose. He's very purposeful. Um, he wants to spend the rest of his days being a contribution to young people. He has a real heart, a
Mm,
compassion for young people that are where he was back in his early 20s. So his desire to spread the news, to share his story, to enlighten, to inspire, to be a peddler of hope, is very deep and strong, and it's kindred with my own desire. I mean, already written 4 books, all books relating to faith-based mental health. So, we had that mutual passion to tell David's story. I mean, David is. It's amazing to me how busy and productive he is, even behind bars. Letters are written to him from around the world. I think people see him as a place where there's not going to be any judgment, no stones to throw, given his background. So, suicidal teenagers at the cusp of shooting up their school, will write
mm,
David letters. I have many of the copies on my shelf in the back of me, and David will talk them off a ledge. He'll share the gospel. He'll share his own story. He'll empathize. He'll relate. So he's trying to take the time he has left and make as much of a positive impact as he can, to redeem the time, so to speak. When we meet, we both have this mutual passion. And let's face it, the statistics right now, there are 13 mass shootings a week in the United States of America. And that's not the case in Africa and a lot of European nations in the Middle East. 13 mass shootings a week, school shootings, mall shootings. So someone's going to speak to this issue. And that's the journey that David and I took.
yeah. Wow. That's a terrifying statistic. I know this, 13 mass shootings a week, but just at hearing you say it, it just settled on me in a different way.
Hmm.
Yes, and I can see that someone who has been through this horror show, and has repentant and is repentant and is sitting in prison devoted to the cause of helping other people, could be a place where people would go. I wanted to just read something really quickly.
Yeah.
This was early on July 31st, 1977. Secretary Stacy Moskowitz and clothing salesman Robert Violante, both 20, were sitting in Violante's car, which was parked under a streetlight near a city park in Bath Beach, on their first date. They were kissing when a man approached within 3 feet of the passenger side of the car, fired 4 rounds, striking both victims in the head before he escaped into the park. Violante lost his left eye. Moskowitz, the only blonde victim of Berkowitz, died from her injuries. And then Nasa, am I pronouncing that right? Nasa?
Some say
Moscow,
Nisa.
Nasa. I'll just say Nasa. Moskowitz, who had previously not hidden her hatred of Berkowitz. So this is the mother of Stacy Moskowitz, Nasa Moskowitz. She had not hidden her hatred of Berkowitz. She wrote him a letter shortly before her death in 2006, forgiving him for killing her daughter, Stacy. She lost, Nasa Moskowitz had lost all of her children at young ages. Her daughter Jody died at 9 in a possible suicide. In 1968, Stacy, she lost, to that murder, and Ricky, 37, died of scleroderma. I don't know how to pronounce that. In 1988. So she had no survivors, is the point. It was just her at that point. And she wrote David Berkowitz a letter forgiving him. I want to know, One, what you think about that. I think I know what you think about that. But I also want to know how the victims of other families feel about you writing about your relationship with David Berkowitz, and because there were 6 other families, is that correct, who lost people? Um, and I'm just curious, like how that plays, and were you thinking about them when you did the interview, and have you gotten any feedback?
Yeah, the relationship that David had with Nisa is a very interesting relationship. I also have letters between the two of them. Nisa started out being his biggest opponent. I mean, you can go on YouTube and look at interviews done with her in court, outside of court hearings. I mean, just calling him a dog, and rightfully so. I mean, the pain that she endured losing young Stacy. Stacy left the house that night. Nisa said to her, "Stacy, please be careful. There's a madman. He's killing young ladies." And she said, "Mom, I'm safe. He's not targeting blondes." That was the last statement that Nisa heard her daughter say. So she spent years feeling the grief and the loss of beautiful Stacy, hated David. And then in the late 1980s, um, she was living in Miami, I want to say, and she told her neighbor, she said, I was so consumed with hatred. Forgiveness was really the only way out. And she forgave David. She began a relationship. They never met personally, but they corresponded on through letter, and they talked on the phone. I remember I asked David, I said, David, what did she call you? I mean, I heard her call him every name in the book, in some of the earlier interviews in the 70s and the 80s. And she said she called me Davy, like a term of affection. And sure enough, that was the term in the letters that David gave me. She actually had asked David at one point to pray for her daughter that died later on. His Nisa asking David, the man who killed Stacy, to pray for her other daughter who
Mhm.
was sick. I mean, the relationship with them was just incredible. She did die in the early 2000s of cancer. It really broke David's heart. They had formed a pretty tight friendship for a number of years. Another one of David's victims who survived, a guy by the name of Carl Denaro. Carl was shot in Queens. Carl is still living today. He lives in Queens still. We became very friendly. Carl and I. We had dinner together, and I took Carl to meet with David Berkowitz. And I don't talk about that meeting in the book. I wanted to respect Carl, and I wanted to wait for him to tell the story, which he just began telling the story about a month ago or so.
Mm.
You can go on YouTube and look it up. I think the name of the broadcast is Son of Sam Chronicles, with a guy by the name of Rocker Mike. But he interviews Carl, and Carl tells the story of myself, Carl, and David face to face at Shawagunk Correctional Facility in Wallkill, New York. And Carl and David, and just an amazing moment to sit there and witness a couple of hours of back and forth. But yeah, David has made himself available as much as he can to those that he's affected, those that he's wounded, those that he's hurt. So to see people like Stacy's mom, Nisa, to see others forgive David, um, it definitely made it easier for me. I mean, I'm a father of 3 girls. There were many moments during this journey where it was like, all my girls now, they're all older. My youngest is going to be 18. My oldest is 30 in New Orleans. To think about my young girls, but to think about Nisa and her forgiveness towards David, it really warmed my heart and opened me up to a relationship with him.
Wow. That's that really gives me like another layer to this, knowing that
Mhm.
you were able to witness that moment between Carl, right?
Yes.
And David Berkowitz. Um, because that's something that maybe you could hear about, but to have actually seen it with your own eyes and felt what that was like in the room, because I know that forgiveness is palpable. You could feel it. It's not, you can feel when it's in the air, when someone is truly forgiving and not just saying the words. Um,
Mm.
there is something else there. And I wanted to just ask you, because you kind of touched on this a little bit. You mentioned that when you were 17 that you were dealing with some depression then. And I gotta just imagine that sitting with not not that sitting with David Berkowitz necessarily would be depressing, but how do you talk about what happened and what he did without carrying the weight of that? How did you protect yourself from not coming away, like you said, as a father of three girls, and not personalizing that, and not, how did you protect yourself or take care of yourself
Yeah.
during that time?
Well, empathy is part and parcel with the journey like this. You can't collect data in this fashion and not be empathetic. When I say empathy, I don't just mean the emotion of empathy, but also the cognition, to think like he thinks, cognitive empathy, and to feel what he feels, emotional empathy. I mean, you have to empathize. There's no other way around it. You got to put yourself in the person's shoes, and that can be exhausting. I mean, even the clinical community has conceptualized the idea of compassion fatigue,
Right.
where you spend enough time exposing yourself to the traumas of other people, and it can wear on you. I certainly know what that's about from pastoring all those years and suffering the heart attacks. I guess my my saving grace would be I have a relationship with God. I've got to, at the end of the day, surrender it to Him and say, Lord, look, David Berkowitz, the victims, all that's happened, this is in your hands. I can't, the Messiah complex that I had in my 20s as a pastor, and even into my 30s, I took off the cape. So I'm not everybody's savior. I'm not the Messiah. I can't fix this. I didn't cause this. I can't. There's nothing I can do about it. I've got to put it in your hands, and I got to go to sleep tonight. I mean, I have a conversation with God every night, and it usually goes like this. I think about my problems, and I think, you know what, God, the Bible says that you don't sleep. So I'm going to go to sleep because there's no point in two of us being awake. So I'm going to let you handle my problems, which are your problems. You work the night shift, and I'm going to go to sleep. And that's what I do as a lifestyle of surrender. That keeps me from exhaustion and burning out.
So you literally don't carry it, basically. Like you
No,
don't,
you carry it for a few hours,
right? But
but then
then
you
you
unburden it.
surrender it to.
Yes,
I
sure.
mean, that's wonderful, and I love that your explanation of how you do it. Um, if someone didn't have that relationship with God, if someone didn't have that relationship with a higher power, what suggestions would you have for them? Because even just visiting family members in prison, like over and over and over again, can be really exhausting. Or anybody, sitting with someone who's not getting better from whatever it is. What other suggestions do you have for people who are going through things like that, who need some self care?
Yeah, you're probably not going to like this answer, but I can't fathom how I would make it without a higher power. I can't fathom that. It's like asking a plumber a question about electricity. I don't know. It's not something I could fathom. I mean, the last, several decades of my life, he's been the place I go. I don't know how someone can do it without that. I mean, my perspective of mankind's makeup is, yes, we are emotional and we are rational and we're social and we're physical, but we're also existential. It's part of our makeup is that we ask the deeper questions like, what's the point of life? Is there something beyond this realm? And I don't know how that existential dimension of man's makeup is satiated without there being some kind of belief in a higher power. So I'm sorry to give you that answer. It's the only
No.
answer I can really give you. I don't want to, I don't want to make something up.
No, I want you to be honest, and I appreciate that too. And I really appreciate the fact that you are coming from this place where you have found a path that really works for you, but you don't seem to be at all judgmental about people who aren't on that particular path, which really widens the road and allows people to connect into your story. When when you went to see him, where what prison was it?
It's called Shawagunk. It's in Wallkill, New York. It's not far from the Newburgh area.
Okay.
Actually, Newburgh is right on the border of Shawagunk, probably about 45 miles from the Bronx, about maybe 2 hours and 40 minutes from where I live in Rhode Island, I would drive up to the prison twice a month, every other week, and the sessions usually lasted between 2.5 to 3.5 hours each.
Wow. Wow. Okay. And I know that he was, because you sent him your book, he was pleased to sit down with you and talk to you about what happened. Was most of your discussions, or most of your discussions not about, or most of your discussions about what had happened to him since he went to prison, since felt since he converted, or were they about what got him there? Did you talk at all about like what it felt like for him to be possessed? Did you talk about any of that stuff?
Oh yeah, we went right back to the beginning of his time, his arrival on planet Earth.
Oh,
Actually, even before that, we spoke about the 9 months in his mother's womb and what her pregnancy was like. I wanted to shed light on that because I teach at three colleges. I teach at two right now. I teach criminal psychology. I teach abnormal psychology. I teach social psychology. I teach counseling, and I teach human growth and development. And I lecture on human growth and development, on prenatal programming or
mm,
prenatal development, what happens in the 9 months when the fetus is in the womb, and the type of learning that's happening. We think learning begins in a classroom or the playground. Learning begins in the womb. And the kind of learning that happens in the womb is the most profound because it's not cognitive, it's visceral. It's the shaping of the central nervous system. So we spoke at great length, me being educated in human behavior and human development, great length about his 9 months in the womb, about his infancy, toddler years, adolescence, all the way into young adult years when the crimes began. The book is a very thorough analysis from the womb to the tomb. Well, not the tomb yet,
yeah.
but from the beginning of his life to now his aging years in his 70s, and understanding both the making of a serial killer as well as the making of a saint.
Wow. That's really profound
Well,
right
now let me
there.
qualify saint because I know I'm
Yeah.
going to get some critical
Yeah.
feedback.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're saying David Berkowitz is a saint. I don't mean like Mother Teresa. When we say saint as Christians, we just simply mean someone that is converted to the Christian faith. It's not someone that's reached a certain status,
Got
of
it.
miracles or being a good person. Once you become a Christian, you're considered a saint.
Was there a time as he's telling you about, when he was in the womb and his childhood and those young adult years before he started committing the crimes, where you were like, aha, this is where it started, then this was the point? Was there a time like
Oh,
that?
absolutely. Yeah, it was right in the womb. While he was a fetus, his mother, biological mom, wanted to keep him. This is back in the early 1950s in Brooklyn. And the biological father was already married. The mom was his mistress, and he was a very proud Jewish man having this extramarital affair. And he didn't want her to keep him. And they would have fistfights
Oh,
on a regular basis. Just she would just jump on him, and it was a very tumultuous 9 months. Now we know through the data, and lots of money is being spent on research in this area, that what happens in the womb will shape lifespan trajectories. For instance, the babies that were, or the fetuses during 9/11, pregnant moms that lived in Lower Manhattan in the 6 months following the attack on America, the Twin Towers, that time period for New York was just hysteria. I know I was there, 9/12, the day after. It was a very hysterical time. While those moms that were pregnant, those babies showed signs of PTSD far greater than the
mm,
general population. So we know that there are some, influencing factors that happen during the prenatal time period. Now, let me just say this, because I know that the viewer is going to think, well, that doesn't make a serial killer. There's no one particular factor that we can say is why David Berkowitz became a serial killer. I would caution anyone in trying to explain human behavior from a very common trap known as causal reductionism. Causal reductionism means taking a complicated phenomenon and oversimplifying it to one single factor. That would be as idiotic as playing the game Jenga, where you're building a tower of blocks and it collapses and you blame the last block for being the reason behind the collapse of the tower. You know it's a buildup of blocks. You know it's a series of factors. It's not one factor. So, what happened in the womb is just one ingredient in this recipe called violence. You can't make a recipe with one ingredient. You need multiple ingredients. And we identify in the book, David and I, 9 particular ingredients in this recipe called violence.
Interesting. And then that process started because he was in such a violent home when he was in utero that
When he was in
he
utero,
had that
right.
in him, in his nervous system, in his central nervous system. There was that propensity for violence. He had already experienced that violence, right?
Well, I mean, he came out of the womb and right away he was a very hard to handle baby. At 4 days old, his mom, biological mom, Betty, not wanting to, but under the pressure of her mister, she handed him over to the Berkowitz family. They adopted him at 4 days old. They drove from the Bronx, the South Bronx, to Brooklyn Hospital, as it was known back then, and they handed him over at 4 days old. And their own account is that drive from Brooklyn to the Bronx, that baby would not stop crying. In fact, it was a constant thing almost every night. They just could not comfort the baby. And I also talk about, this bond disruption, what's often known in behavioral science as a primal wound. If you form a bond with your biological caretaker, your mom, for 9 months, and then that bond is severed, it's no surprise to me that serial killers are 15 times more likely to have been adopted. 15 times more likely
Wow.
to have been adopted than the general population. That's not to say every adoptee is going to become a serial killer, but there is a high percentage that suffer from attachment disorders. And David Berkowitz exhibited all the signs of attachment disorders from the time he was a young baby. His parents, his adopted parents, they spared no time, money, effort in trying to love him, but it was like trying to stick something on a wet surface. The love just wasn't sticking. He was pushing them away from a very young age.
Wow. Wow. I was going to read something else that's very quick. At his sentencing 2 weeks later, Berkowitz caused an uproar or this is 2 weeks later, this is after the trial, caused an uproar when he attempted to jump out of a window of the 7th floor courtroom. After he was restrained, he repeatedly chanted, Stacy, his last victim that we talked about, was a whore. And he shouted, I'd kill her again. I'd kill them all again. The court ordered another psychiatric examination before sentencing could proceed. During the evaluation, Berkowitz sketched a jailed man surrounded by numerous walls. At the bottom, he wrote, quote, I am not well at all. But he was found competent to stand trial. Do you think that was a miscarriage of justice there? Do you think he should be in an institution instead of a prison?
Well, it's an interesting story. I mean, his lawyer had told him at one point, David, not guilty by reason of insanity is very likely, given the nature of your crimes. I mean, when the police raided his apartment at 45 Pine Street in Yonkers, New York, there was a watermelon-size hole in the wall with doodling that said, my name is Mr. Williams. I am raising little killers, and I live inside this hole. I mean, his apartment was as dark and deranged as it gets. So he had a very good chance of being found not guilty by reason of insanity. Dr. Schwartz, the forensic psychiatrist, had diagnosed him as paranoid schizophrenic. He had the evidence to back up the fact that he could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, Dr. David Abrahamson, the prosecution's attorney, found him to be more of a psychopath than psychotic, meaning manipulative, calculating, knew exactly what he was doing. But it was still a good chance that he would have been found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was meeting at the time with the Christian minister, an African-American lady from Staten Island. Her name was Ali, Ollie. She ended up dying maybe 15 years ago. But she died in the early 80s. She'd visit him, and she'd read the Bible to him, and they would sing hymns and reports.
This was during the trial?
Yeah, this is during the early on when he was in Kings County. He
Okay.
wasn't even sentenced yet. But somewhere during that time, he actually left one of the sessions with her and he looked at his lawyer and he said, I'm pleading guilty. He said, I did this.
Wow.
So David himself was adamant about the fact that he knew what he was doing and that he deserved whatever sentence he received. So he was actually the one that decided that he should be, found guilty rather than not guilty. Looking back, I think that Dr. Schwartz was partly right. I do think that David had some psychotic breaks. I don't think he was schizophrenic. I think he'd be more classified as antisocial personality disorder or the cultural term psychopath with psychotic breaks. But there's a great deal of calculation and methodology that was involved in the crimes that I wouldn't classify him as a true schizophrenic or somebody that had, pure psychosis. A guy like that would kill somebody and there'd be no cover up. He'd probably be sitting over the body when the police showed up,
Mm-hmm.
talking in a deranged fashion. I mean, David played cat and mouse very effectively for a good
Yeah.
15, 16 months. So I don't think he was completely deranged. I think he had some psychotic breaks. But he himself owned it from the beginning and said, I deserve to be behind bars.
Wow. Um, I can see that my time is coming to, or our time is coming to a close, but I did want to ask you another question, and thank you for that. This has all been really fascinating, and I really hope that our listeners buy your book, Monster Mirror.
May
But
I say this?
yes,
It ranked on Amazon number one true crime in October when it was released. It's done
yes,
very well. It's sold thousands. Right now, I want to say about 9 or 10 juvenile detention centers in the United States. Every inmate in those juvenile detention centers in New York City, I'm sorry, in Long Island, in Florida, in Cook County in Chicago. They have copies of it. It has sold thousands. You can go on Amazon today and buy it at a discounted rate. I think it's like $16.95 right now on Amazon.
it's fantastic. And congratulations on getting it into the hands of people that really need it. Getting it into all
Thank
those
you.
facilities, because people who feel alone or need to see that somebody gets better, even if they're still in prison, that there was a freedom that I'm assuming that's the label I would put on what you're describing. David Berkowitz has now, that he feels free to reach out and help people. He's had forgiveness. I'm sure he's dealt with forgiving himself. But I wanted to ask you, why Monster Mirror? Why that title?
Well, I thought in hearing David's story, younger David, that I would come face to face with the monster. But surprisingly, I looked into a mirror and realized that the themes that we uncovered, the ingredients to this recipe called violence, were not exotic ingredients that you can't find anywhere, but they're in everyone's cabinet, including mine. Themes like isolation, shame, abandonment, cognitive distortions, and talking about resentment and realizing that, wow, we think the psychopath is this other person. We think, well, other kids will shoot up schools, not my kids. Other people will commit homicide, never me. But I would challenge the reader that if you, and I mean this facetiously, if you spend 6 months brooding on your resentments, 6 months isolating from community, 6 months berating yourself, living in a perpetual state of shame, you'll be shocked at what you might evolve into. Now, that's not a popular idea. We live in a very humanistic society that says everybody is wonderful and that the potential for evil, what Carl Jung called the shadow, is not something that most people confront. We see ourselves as wonderful people. There are no other people. What David Berkowitz did, there but for the grace of God, so go I. And what I saw in David, I saw the potentiality in myself. Now, that is an ancient presupposition that we've moved away from in our culture. But if you go back to books like Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky in the late 1800s, it discusses an average guy who morphs into a murderer in a very detailed fashion, because I believe that there's a potential monster in everybody providing the wrong set of choices over enough of a period of time, you'd be shocked at what you can evolve into. And history would back me up on this. If you go back in times of history like 1940s Germany, so many different periods where humanity was not at its best, but it was at its worst. So when I looked at David's eyes, I didn't see a monster. I saw a mirror.
Wow. Wow. I knew that answer, but I wanted to hear you say it because one, it's really powerful. And two, I think it will help people, like, why monster mirror, like how does Dr. Caparelli even begin to empathize with somebody like David Berkowitz? And I think your explanation just now was really sound, and it allows people to maybe open up their minds a little bit to see where we can see ourselves in each other, and as humans. And yeah, I've had more questions. I could have talked to you for longer, but we're at the end of our time, and I just really want to thank you for coming on to have this discussion with me and be as vulnerable and revealing as you were. I really appreciate that. Those are the discussions that our listeners look forward to. This is a storytelling podcast, and you told your story really well. So thank you, Dr. Caparelli.
Thank you for having me. I wish you well with your podcast, and I hope you're able to be a light in the dark world that we're in.